June 1942, a small ring of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, no bigger than a fingernail on a map. The Americans called it Midway. Within 72 hours, the most powerful navy in the world would burn here, not from battleships. Not from cannon fire, from paper, from radio static, from the obsession of one man working in a basement in carpet slippers. This is the story of how the Pacific War was decided by men no one would ever name in public. 6 months earlier, December 7, 1941, the water at Pearl Harbor caught fire. 18 American warships sank or shattered against their moorings. Nearly 200 aircraft burned on the ground. Over 3,500 sailors were killed or wounded before they had finished their morning coffee. The Japanese lost 29 planes. In Tokyo they called it a miracle. In Washington they called it infamy. In a hospital bed in Honolulu, a young seaman woke up missing his leg and asked the nurse if the war was over. It had only just started. The empire moved like fire across a dry field. Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines. Singapore fell in 70 days. By March of 1942, the flag of the rising sun flew over almost a third of the surface of the earth. There was talk in the Japanese newspapers of a new order, a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a 1,000-year empire. Then came the morning of April 18, 1942. 16 American B-25 medium bombers lifted off the wooden flight deck of the carrier Hornet, about 700 miles east of Japan. They were not supposed to be able to do this. Twin-engine bombers were too large for carrier operations. It was supposed to be impossible. The pilots had practiced for weeks on a marked-off section of an airstrip in Florida, learning how to launch a plane in 300 feet of deck. They flew low over the rooftops of Tokyo, past temples, past schoolyards, past stunned policemen, and they dropped their bombs. The damage was small, the shock was atomic. For the first time in living memory, an enemy had struck the home islands. The Emperor himself had been within range of foreign explosives. The myth of invincibility cracked open like an egg on a stone. In a wardroom aboard the battleship Yamato, a 58-year-old admiral set down his sake cup very slowly. He had studied at Harvard. He had walked the streets of Detroit and Chicago. He had toured American steel mills as a young attaché and counted the smokestacks. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and he believed that Japan had a window of perhaps 6 more months. After that, he had told his superiors, the Americans would build 100 ships for every Japanese one. The arithmetic was not a guess, it was a calculation. He needed a battle, a single, final, decisive battle, before the steel mills of Pittsburgh buried him. In early May 1942, the first carrier battle in human history was fought in the Coral Sea, north of Australia. 2 flat tops on each side. They never saw one another. The fighting was done by planes flying hundreds of miles, looking for ships that were also looking for them. It lasted 4 days. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington, burning from a fuel vapor explosion deep in her belly. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho in barely 10 minutes. But the real damage was hidden inside the official reports. The Japanese fleet carrier Shukaku had taken 3 bombs. She would limp home and spend months in dry dock. Her sister ship Zuikaku had survived without a scratch, but her pilots were dead or floating in the South Pacific. The veteran squadrons were gutted. There was no time to train replacements. When Yamamoto looked at the order of battle for his great decisive operation, 2 of his 6 finest aircraft carriers were missing. Not sunk, just absent. At the worst possible moment, he did not postpone the operation. He did not know that this was already the first crack in everything. The plan was called Operation MI, M for Midway. It was a masterpiece of complexity, the kind of plan that only an overconfident navy designs. 4 fleet carriers, 11 battleships, 23 cruisers, 60 destroyers, over 200 warships in total, spread out across thousands of miles of ocean, all coordinated by a system of radio signals and rigid schedules. The bait was Midway Atoll, a coral speck 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, seized the airfield, threatened Pearl Harbor itself, and when the American carriers came rushing out to defend, ambushed them with overwhelming force. Annihilate them. Yamamoto wrote in a letter during those days that he felt like a man at a poker table with everything he owned in the pot. He believed in the cards. He did not know that the Americans were reading them. 3,000 miles to the east, beneath an administration building at Pearl Harbor, there was a basement. It had no windows. It smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee, and the sour breath of men who had not been outside in days. The air conditioning broke down regularly. The men slept on cots between shifts. Some had not gone home to their wives in weeks. The man in charge was 42 years old. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He wore a maroon smoking jacket over his Navy uniform. He shuffled across the concrete floor in carpet slippers. His superiors in Washington thought he was eccentric. His friends thought he was a genius. His enemies, and he had a great many, thought he was a problem that would have to be dealt with eventually. Rochefort and his team were trying to break the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. JN-25 was not one code. It was layers of codes, a 5-digit number book encrypted by an additive cipher that the Japanese rotated regularly. Most messages came through as gibberish. The team picked at the gibberish with tweezers, day after day, looking for fragments. By early May, they had assembled enough scraps to suspect that something terrible was coming. A massive operation, multiple fleets, a target somewhere in the Central Pacific. The target had a 2-letter designation, AF. Rochefort was certain AF was Midway. Washington was certain it was not. The Office of Naval Intelligence on the East Coast believed AF was Hawaii itself, or perhaps the American West Coast. If they were right and Rochefort was wrong, the Pacific Fleet would steam in the wrong direction, and Midway would be lost. Rochefort needed proof. Concrete, undeniable proof, so he designed a trick. He sent a message to the small marine garrison stationed on Midway Atoll. Send a radio transmission, he instructed them. Send it in the clear, in plain English, with no encryption at all. Tell anyone listening that your freshwater distillation plant has broken down, that you are running dangerously low on drinking water. The Marines did as they were told. 2 days later, a Japanese listening post in the Marshall Islands picked up an encrypted message and relayed it to Tokyo. Rochefort's team intercepted that message. They decoded it, they translated it. AF is short of fresh water. Rochefort stared at the line on the page. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply walked upstairs to the office of his commander-in-chief, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Midway was the target, and the Americans now knew the approximate date, a 4-day window, June 4th through June 8th. The trap could be set, but to spring it, 3 American carriers had to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The man who was supposed to lead those carriers into battle was Vice Admiral William Halsey, Bull Halsey, aggressive, profane. Reckless, beloved by his men, the kind of commander you wanted leading a charge. When Halsey returned to Pearl Harbor in late May aboard the Enterprise, his executive officer was shocked at the sight of him. The admiral was covered in raw, weeping sores. A severe inflammatory skin condition had eaten across his arms, his torso, his face. He could not sleep. He could not bear the touch of his own uniform against his skin. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. He was admitted to the Naval Hospital immediately. The doctors told him he would not be leaving the ward for weeks. Halsey raged at them. He demanded to be released. He was overruled. But before they sedated him, Admiral Nimitz came to his bedside. The Pacific Fleet was about to walk into the most important battle of its history, and it needed a commander. Halsey gave him a name, Raymond Spruance. Nimitz blinked. Spruance was Halsey's cruiser screen commander, a quiet, methodical man of 55. A reader of philosophy books. He took long walks in the evenings and disliked small talk. He had never commanded an aircraft carrier in his life. He had never directed a carrier airstrike. He had never even served on a carrier for an extended tour. He was the opposite of Halsey in every imaginable way. "He's the man," Halsey said from the hospital bed. "Trust him." Nimitz did. It was perhaps the single most consequential personnel decision of the entire Pacific War. By the end of May 1942, all the pieces had begun to move. In Hashirajima, Yamamoto's battleship steamed out of harbor under a low grey sky. In the cold waters east of Hokkaido, a diversionary force pointed itself north toward the Aleutian Islands. In the Central Pacific, 4 fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a 55-year-old destroyer veteran who had never asked to command carriers, ploughed eastward toward Midway at 24 knots. And from Pearl Harbor, 3 American carriers slipped out of port unseen: Enterprise, Hornet, and a wounded ghost called Yorktown that nobody on either side of the ocean believed was even capable of leaving harbor. The greatest naval ambush in history was about to begin, but none of the men sailing toward Midway on either side understood the full shape of what was coming. Not Yamamoto, with his Harvard education and his poker player's heart. Not Nagumo, sailing into a battle his entire career had not prepared him for. Not even Nimitz, listening to decrypted radio traffic in his quiet office, the most powerful man in the Pacific and the most uncertain. Only one man might have guessed, a man in carpet slippers in a basement at Pearl Harbor, watching the dots on a chart move slowly closer together. And even he could not have predicted the strangest thing of all, that the entire war in the Pacific would turn on 5 minutes that would not happen the way anyone planned. The Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on the morning of May 27, 1942, trailing oil and smoke and the dead of her own crew. She had taken a bomb at the Coral Sea 18 days earlier. The bomb had punched down through her wooden flight deck and detonated 3 decks below, in the middle of a photographic laboratory. It killed 50 men where they stood. Some of them were still inside the ship when she reached port. The damage reports came up to Admiral Nimitz that afternoon. The shipyard estimate for full repairs was 90 days, 3 months. Nimitz read the report. He set it down on his desk. He looked across the room at his shipyard superintendent, and he gave him an order the man would never forget. You have 72 hours, 3 days. 1,500 shipyard workers descended on the Yorktown in shifts that never stopped. Welders, pipe fitters, carpenters, electricians, boys from Honolulu and old Navy men with 30 years on the job, they worked through the night under arc lights that turned the dry dock into a small white sun. They ate cold sandwiches on the deck plates and slept where they fell. New steel had to be cut and shaped and welded into the hull. Watertight bulkheads had to be rebuilt by hand. 3 boilers had to be made to breathe again. When the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor on May 30, there were still welders aboard who had not been able to get off in time. They worked their way through the lower decks all the way out to sea. Some of them rowed the carrier toward battle, putting the finishing touches on her wounds. This was the 3rd aircraft carrier the Americans should not have had. In Tokyo, the planners of Operation MI had filed Yorktown away in the column of confirmed kills. The radio intercepts had said as much. The photographs had confirmed it. They were quite certain there were only 2 American carriers in the Pacific. They were wrong. By June 2nd, 2 American task forces had met at a stretch of empty ocean north of Midway, marked on the charts only with the words Point Luck. Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with the ghost carrier Yorktown. Fletcher was the senior officer. Both men were 55 years old. Both had been promoted by attrition. Neither one had spent his career preparing for what was about to happen. They waited. To the west, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had set the Pacific on fire at Pearl Harbor, was steaming straight into their trap. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, some of the finest warships ever built, hundreds of veteran pilots, men who had fought from Hawaii to Ceylon, who had never lost a major engagement, who had begun to believe that they could not lose. The morning of June 4, 1942, came up clear over the Central Pacific, a high overcast in the west, light winds out of the southeast. The sun would not rise for another hour. By that hour, Nagumo had already turned his ships into the wind and launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft thundered off the 4 flight decks in less than 15 minutes, 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying land attack bombs, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Zero fighters as escort. They formed up in the dark sky and pointed themselves southeast toward the island. Nagumo held the rest of his planes in reserve. The torpedo bombers were armed with armor-piercing torpedoes. The Vals were loaded with anti-ship bombs. These were the weapons he would use against the American fleet, if the American fleet ever appeared. He did not believe it would. The Japanese strike hit Midway just after 6:30 in the morning. They blew apart the seaplane hangars on Sand Island. They burned the fuel tanks. They killed the Marine fighter squadron that rose to meet them, an obsolete collection of Buffalo fighters and Wildcats that were no match for the Zeros. 15 American fighters were shot down. Most of the boys flying them were killed. But when the strike leader, a young commander named Joichi Tomonaga, circled back over the smoking island just before 7, he saw that the runways were still operational. The hangars were burning, but the airstrip itself was largely intact. American patrol planes had already lifted off and were scattered across the Pacific. The strike had not been decisive. He radioed Nagumo. There is need of a second attack wave. In that moment, 400 miles to the southeast, an American PBY Catalina patrol plane was flying low over the Dawn Sea. The pilot was an ensign named Howard Addy. He had been in the air for hours. He was exhausted and bored and squinting through his binoculars at the haze of the horizon. And then he saw them. Ships, many ships, spread out across the water like a city. He held the binoculars very still. He counted again. Main body, he wrote on his flight log. He keyed his radio. The signal flashed across the Pacific to Midway, to Pearl Harbor, to the flag bridge of the Enterprise. The Japanese carriers had been found. On the Yorktown, Frank Jack Fletcher read the dispatch and gave the order to launch. On the Enterprise, Raymond Spruance, the quiet cruiser admiral who had never run a carrier air operation in his life, did the same. The American carriers turned into the wind. The flight decks came alive. This was the moment, the only moment. Catch the Japanese carriers while their planes were away over Midway. Catch them while their decks were empty. Catch them blind. They began launching their aircraft just after 7 o'clock. There was a problem. The torpedo bombers were too slow. The fighters did not have the range to escort them all the way. The dive bombers climbed faster and flew higher and could not stay together with the slower planes below. The squadrons came apart in the sky before they ever reached the Japanese fleet. The torpedo squadrons would arrive first. They would arrive alone. They would arrive without fighter cover. The men flying them already knew what that meant. Aboard the Hornet, the commander of Torpedo Squadron 8 gathered his pilots in the ready room before launch. His name was John Charles Waldron. He was 41 years old. He had been born in South Dakota, of partial Sioux ancestry on his mother's side, and he had a face like weathered leather and eyes that did not blink very often. He had been a Navy pilot for 15 years. The aircraft his squadron flew was the Douglas TBD Devastator. The name was a lie. The Devastator was already obsolete when the war began. It cruised at 100 knots. Its torpedoes ran slow and shallow and often failed to explode. Its defensive armament was a single machine gun in the rear cockpit. Waldron looked at his 15 pilots. They were boys, most of them. Ensigns barely out of flight school. The youngest was 23. My greatest hope, he wrote in a letter to them that morning, is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we do not, and worst comes to worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. He told them he believed every one of them would do his duty. Then he led them out to their aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 8 lifted off the Hornet's deck at 8:15 in the morning, 15 Devastators with 30 men aboard them. Pilots in the front cockpit, radio gunners behind. They formed up over the water and pointed themselves toward the position the scouts had given them. The position was wrong. Nagumo had turned his fleet during the time it took the Americans to launch. The Hornet's air group leader took his planes south. He guessed wrong. The dive bombers and fighters of Hornet would never find the Japanese carriers that day. Waldron broke formation. He had no radar. He had no functioning radio contact with his superiors. He had only the cold instinct of an old hunter who had spent his life reading wind and water. He turned his squadron north. He flew directly toward the enemy. At 9:20 in the morning, Torpedo Squadron 8 came down to wave top height and began its attack run on the Japanese carrier force. They had no fighter escort, they had no support, they had nothing but their slow, ugly torpedo bombers and the orders of a man who had told them he believed in them. The Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters saw them coming from above. The Zeros peeled off and dove. They came apart in the sky one at a time. The Devastators were too slow to evade. Their gunners fired back with their single machine guns, and the Zeros took them down with 20mm cannon. Waldron's plane was hit in the fuel tank. He flew it burning toward a carrier and was last seen trying to climb out onto the wing. He never reached the water. In 10 minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were destroyed. 29 of the 30 men were killed. The 30th was a 25-year-old ensign from Texas named George Henry Gay. His radio gunner was already dead behind him when his plane hit the water. Gay scrambled out of the cockpit as the Devastator sank under him. He was wounded in the hand and the leg. The torpedo had not released properly, and the entire airframe went down with the torpedo still attached. Gay found a black rubber seat cushion floating among the wreckage. He pulled it over his head to hide from the Japanese ships steaming past him at 25 knots. He was perhaps a half-mile from the carrier Akagi when she went by. For the next several hours, George Gay floated alone in the Central Pacific, alive only by the accident of one rubber cushion and the indifference of the ocean. He watched the Japanese fleet maneuver around him. He watched the next American attack come in and die. He watched the planes burn. He was, in the strangest way possible, the only American eyewitness to what happened next. Behind Torpedo 8 came Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise. 14 planes. They were also slaughtered. Only 4 returned. Behind them came Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. 12 planes. 7 were shot down. In all, 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet that morning. 32 were destroyed. Not one torpedo found its mark. Not one. By all the laws of war, the attack had been a complete failure. Aboard the Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo received the reports of the torpedo attacks with grim satisfaction. His combat air patrol of Zeros had shot the Americans out of the sky almost without effort. His ships had not been touched. His decks were undamaged, but there was a problem on the Akagi's hangar deck. There was a problem on all 4 of the Japanese carriers. Tomonaga's request for a second strike had come just before 7. By that point, Nagumo had ordered the reserve planes brought up from below and rearmed. The Kate torpedo bombers had their armor-piercing torpedoes removed and replaced with general-purpose bombs for hitting the island. Hundreds of sailors had wrestled the heavy torpedoes off the airframes and replaced them with bombs. The torpedoes were stacked along the bulkheads of the hangar deck because there was no time to lower them back into the magazines. Then at 7:28 a scout plane radioed in. Enemy ships sighted to the east. 10 ships. The composition was unclear. Nagumo froze. He had been about to launch his second strike against Midway. Now he was being told the American fleet might be at sea after all. For more than half an hour, the scout failed to specify what kind of ships he had spotted. Were they carriers? Were they cruisers? Were they transports? The Japanese reconnaissance system was failing in real time, and Nagumo was being asked to make the most important decision of his life with incomplete information. He waited. At 8:20 the scout finally radioed. Enemy ships appear to include 1 carrier. There it was, Nagumo's worst nightmare. An American flat-top in striking range. When half his strike force was loaded with the wrong weapons, he gave the order to rearm again. Take the bombs off the Kates, put the torpedoes back on. The hangar decks of Akagi and Kaga turned into a controlled madhouse. Ordnance carts wheeled across steel decking. Bombs were stacked in growing piles because there was no time to return them to the magazines. Fuel lines snaked across the floor as planes were refueled and rearmed in a rush. The safety protocols were ignored. There was no time. The popular story you may have heard says that the Japanese carriers were minutes away from launching a perfect strike when the American dive bombers fell on them. That story comes mostly from the memoir of a single Japanese officer written years after the war. Modern research, drawing on the actual Japanese battle records, tells a different story. The Japanese were not 5 minutes from launching. They were probably 30 or 40 minutes away. The decks were chaotic. The first planes were just being spotted on the flight deck of the Akagi, but the chaos was real, the exposed ordnance was real. The fuel was real, and the failure of Japanese reconnaissance had cost them a full hour. That hour had a name. It had a cause. At dawn that morning, Nagumo had ordered 7 scout planes launched to search the seas around his fleet. 2 from the Akagi, 2 from the Kaga, 1 from the battleship Haruna, 1 from the cruiser Tone, 1 from the cruiser Chikuma. The Tone Scout was the most important one. Its assigned search pattern covered exactly the patch of ocean where the American carriers were waiting. It was supposed to launch at 4:30 in the morning. Along with the others, it did not. The catapult on the Tone malfunctioned. The mechanism that hurled the seaplane into the air would not function. The crew worked frantically to repair it. The launch was delayed by 30 minutes. The scout from the Chikuma, meanwhile, took off on schedule but had engine trouble. Visibility into its assigned search area was reduced. The pilot reported nothing. That 30-minute delay was the gap. That was the window. In the half hour during which the Tone Scout was supposed to have been flying over the empty sea between Japan and Hawaii, it was sitting on the deck. And in that same half hour, the American Task Force 16 was steaming through the very water it would have searched. When the Tone Scout finally got airborne and made its slow run across the assigned arc, the American carriers had already moved out of position. The first sighting did not come until well after 7. The carrier identification did not come until 8:20. By that hour, the American dive bombers were already in the air. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo did not know it. As he stood on the bridge of the Akagi at 10 o'clock in the morning, watching his frantic crews wrestle ordnance across the hangar decks, watching the smoke clear from the last failed American torpedo run, he believed he was still in control. He believed his ships were safe. He believed he was about to launch the strike that would end the American Pacific Fleet forever. High above him, screened by a thin layer of cloud at 20,000 feet, 2 formations of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown were converging on his fleet from different directions. They had come close to missing the battle entirely. One of their commanders had made a guess that should have failed, and had not. The men in those dive bombers had perhaps 3 minutes to live. So did the 4 greatest aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 10:22 in the morning, June 4, 1942, the war in the Pacific changed forever. It changed in the space of 5 minutes. It happened because of luck and exhaustion, and one man's stubbornness, and the dying gift of John Waldron and his pilots, and 1,000 other small things that should not have lined up together. But they did. At 7 o'clock that morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had launched from the deck of the Enterprise with 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers behind him. He was 40 years old. He was the Enterprise Air Group commander. He had been a fighter pilot most of his career, and he had never led a dive bomber strike in his life. He flew southwest on the heading he had been given. He flew for over an hour. He saw nothing but empty ocean. His pilots began to check their fuel gauges. The Dauntless burned aviation gasoline at a brutal rate. They had perhaps 40 more minutes of flight before they would have to turn back. Some of them began doing the math and not liking the answer. McCluskey kept flying. He reached the point where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be. There was no fleet there, just water going in every direction. A lesser officer would have turned around. McCluskey did not. He pushed on for another 50 miles, still nothing. He turned north and began to systematically box the area, burning fuel he would need to get home. And then, far below him on the bright blue surface, he saw a thin white wake, a single ship, a Japanese destroyer running flat out due north. It was the Arashi. She had been left behind by the main fleet to depth charge an American submarine that had stumbled into the Japanese formation. The Arashi had finished her business, and she was now hurrying to rejoin her carriers. She was an arrow drawn on the ocean, pointing the way. McCluskey followed her. At that same moment, from another direction entirely, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie was leading Bombing Squadron 3 off the Yorktown. He was 39 years old. He was a quiet man from Seattle. By an accident of timing and geometry that nobody on either side could have arranged, McCluskey's planes from Enterprise and Leslie's planes from Yorktown arrived above the Japanese fleet within 90 seconds of each other. From different bearings, from different altitudes, coming out of different patches of cloud, the Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters was still down at wave top level, where the doomed American torpedo squadrons had drawn them. The Zeros were just beginning to climb back to altitude to refuel and rearm. The sky above the carriers was empty. It was 10:22 in the morning. The Dauntless dive bomber was an ugly, sturdy thing built around a single 1,000-pound bomb. When it pushed over into its dive, it stood on its nose at near vertical, dive flaps extended, engine howling, slipstream tearing at the canvas of the pilot's helmet. The dive took 30 seconds. At the bottom of it, the pilot released his bomb and pulled back on the stick with both hands, feeling the blood drain from his head as the airframe groaned around him. Down they came. The Kaga went first. 4 bombs found her. The first one destroyed the bridge and killed her captain. The others ripped through her flight deck and into the hangar deck below, where the rearming chaos had filled the space with exposed fuel and stacked ordnance. The fires were instant. The explosions started within seconds and did not stop for hours. The Soryu went second, 3 bombs. Leslie's Yorktown pilots had her. The first dropped into the middle of her flight deck. The second went forward and blew the ammunition stores. The third hit aft and finished the rest. In 20 minutes Soryu was a drifting torch. The Akagi went third. 3 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 6 diverted at the last second when their leader, Lieutenant Richard Best, saw that almost everyone else was attacking Kaga. They lined up on the flagship instead. Best released his own bomb personally. It struck the Akagi between her elevators, punched through her flight deck, and detonated in the hangar where her loaded Kate torpedo bombers waited to launch. The Akagi burned from the inside out. On her bridge stood a 39-year-old commander watching it happen. His name was Mitsuo Fuchida. He had led the airstrike that destroyed Pearl Harbor 6 months before. He had been the angel of death for the American Pacific Fleet. He was supposed to have led the strike that day, but his appendix had been removed a week before the operation, and he had been confined to the carrier as an observer. He watched the flames eat through the deck plates beneath his feet. He watched men he had trained burn alive inside their own aircraft. 5 minutes earlier, he had been winning the war. 1 Japanese carrier had been missed. The Hiryu had been steaming a little apart from her 3 sisters. The dive bombers had not seen her in the clouds. She was now the only Japanese aircraft carrier in the Pacific that was still capable of fighting. Her commander was Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi. He was 49 years old. He had studied at Princeton. He was one of the most respected officers in the Imperial Navy, widely considered Yamamoto's natural successor. He gave the order to launch a counterstrike immediately. 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts lifted off the Hiryu at 10:30. They followed the return path of the American attackers backward. Within an hour they found the Yorktown. They put 3 bombs into her. The Yorktown's damage control parties were the best in any navy in the world. They smothered the fires. They patched the deck. Within an hour the carrier was making 20 knots again and recovering aircraft. The Japanese pilots flying back to Hiryu radioed that an American carrier had been left burning and dead in the water. Yamaguchi launched a second strike on the strength of that report, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 more Zeros. When they arrived over the Yorktown, they assumed she was a different carrier. The first one, they believed, was already sinking. This one must be the second American carrier. They put 2 torpedoes into her port side. The Yorktown listed 26 degrees. Her power failed. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, ordered her abandoned. She had taken a terrible beating, and somehow she had stayed afloat through all of it. But the steel could only do so much. Late that afternoon, an Enterprise scout plane found the Hiryu. The American carriers launched everything they had left. 24 Dauntless dive bombers, including refugees from the abandoned Yorktown who had landed on the Enterprise. They came down on the Hiryu out of the late afternoon sun. 4 bombs hit her. The forward flight deck folded back like a peeled tin can. The elevators blew clear through the deck and lodged against the funnel. She burned through the night. At midnight, Yamaguchi spoke to his surviving crew over the loudspeaker. His voice was steady. "I am responsible for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. I shall remain on board. I order all of you to leave the ship and continue your service to His Majesty the Emperor." He tied himself to the bridge. Captain Tomeo Kaku, the Hiryu's commanding officer, refused to leave him. They stood there together as the destroyers came alongside to take off the surviving crew. They watched the last of their men go over the side. Then they waited. The Hiryu was scuttled at 5 in the morning on June 5th. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with her. For 2 more days the Americans pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. Their dive bombers caught the heavy cruiser Mikuma and pounded her under. The Imperial Navy was in retreat for the first time in 300 years. But the war was not quite finished with the Yorktown. She had not sunk after the abandonment. Her damage control had been too good. She floated on, listing but stable, and on June 6 a salvage party returned to her and began the slow work of saving her. A Japanese submarine found her instead, I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. He had been ordered to shadow the American fleet for any chance to strike. He found one. He fired 4 torpedoes from close range. 2 struck the Yorktown, 1 struck the destroyer Hammond tied alongside, providing power to the salvage operation. The Hammond broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. 80 men went down with her. Some of them were killed when their own depth charges, set for shallow water, exploded as the wreck plunged toward the bottom. The Yorktown sank the next morning at dawn. She rolled over slowly, the great red rust streaks visible along her keel, and slid stern first into water nearly 17,000 feet deep. When the smoke cleared over the Central Pacific, the cost was written. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the heart of the Kido Butai, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They were gone. The heavy cruiser Mikuma was gone, 248 aircraft, 3,057 sailors and airmen. Among them were the irreplaceable veteran pilots and the master mechanics who had given Japan air supremacy across half the world. The Empire would never recover them. The United States Navy had lost the Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, 150 aircraft, 307 men. In one day the strategic balance of the Pacific War turned. It would not turn back. There is one more part of this story. Joseph Rochefort, the man in the maroon smoking jacket, the man whose code-breaking had made the whole victory possible, was nominated for the Distinguished Service Medal by Admiral Nimitz himself. The award was blocked. It was blocked by the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. They had been bitterly opposed to Rochefort's independent operation in Hawaii for years. They had been wrong about the AF target. They had been wrong about the timing. They had been embarrassed by his success. So they punished him. Within weeks of the battle, Rochefort was relieved of his command and reassigned. The Navy sent him to oversee a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The greatest naval cryptanalyst of the Pacific War spent the rest of the war supervising the repair of barges. He retired in 1947 and lived quietly in California until his death in 1976. 10 years after he died in 1986, his daughter accepted the Distinguished Service Medal from the hands of President Ronald Reagan in a ceremony at the White House. The man who had won the Battle of Midway was never told in his own lifetime that he had won it. The Battle of Midway lasted 4 days. The part that mattered lasted 5 minutes. It was decided not by the biggest guns or the bravest hearts or the wisest admirals. It was decided by an unlikely meeting in the sky between 2 squadrons of dive bombers that had no business being there at this time, guided in part by a destroyer's wake on the water and the dying sacrifice of a torpedo squadron led by an old hunter from South Dakota. Some of the men who fought at Midway are still with us, in their late 90s now, fewer every year. The men who did not come home rest in a cemetery on the island of Oahu or in the bottom of the Pacific where they were lost. You may pass men of that generation on the street or sit beside them in a diner. They are quiet. They do not often speak of what they saw. They were boys, most of them, when they were asked to do what they did. We do not get to thank them often enough. We should try.